It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by our reporter Jenny Davidson in Edinburgh and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. This week, the Prime Minister apologises for breaking his own lockdown rules.
As soon as I received the notice, I acknowledged the hurt and the anger. And I said that people had a right to expect better of their Prime Minister.
What a joke. Even now, as the latest mealy-mouthed apology stumbles out of one side of his mouth, a new set of deflections and distortions pour from the other.
This Conservative MP had heard enough.
I'm very sorry to have to say this, but I no longer think he is worthy of the great office that he holds.
And MPs order a parliamentary inquiry into whether the Prime Minister misled the House over lockdown parties. The Home Secretary outlines plans to stop asylum seekers crossing the Channel by sending them to Rwanda.
Those who travel to the UK by illegal and dangerous routes, including by small boats across the Channel, may be relocated to Rwanda, where they will have their asylum claims considered.
The policies that she has announced today are unworkable, unethical and extortionate in the cost for the British taxpayer.
And in Scotland, a row over support for motorists.
Everybody in this chamber knows that all of us, not just in Scotland but across the world, face some really difficult, tough, challenging decisions in the years to come about how we heat our homes and also how we travel around the country.
People still need their cars. And right now, there couldn't be a worse time to further hike the cost of driving.
Let's start here in Westminster with Sean Curran. Sean, we heard there in the headlines, the dominant story in Westminster this week has been this issue of lockdown parties in Downing Street and Whitehall and the fines which have been issued so far. Last week we heard that the Prime Minister had received a fixed penalty notice. How did this week unfold in Parliament?
Yes, Jo, you're absolutely right. We've had a very short parliamentary week, just 3 days. It's been overshadowed by this row over the fines. As you say, the Prime Minister received this fine when Parliament was not sitting during the Easter break. You'll remember he delivered this carefully worded statement to camera from his country retreat Chequers, explaining what had gone on. During that, he said that when he'd attended this birthday gathering in June 2020, it hadn't occurred to him that he might be breaking the rules. But he also promised that he would set the record straight when Parliament returned after Easter. So, setting the scene then for a really big parliamentary moment on Tuesday afternoon. Now, of course, during the Easter break, the Prime Minister also went to Ukraine and he did his walkabout of the Ukrainian capital with President Zelensky. And when it finally came to it and he delivered his statement, he actually spent most of the time talking about Ukraine. But he did begin with an apology for that breach of the lockdown rules. And inevitably, that was really what most of the MPs wanted to talk about.
Let me begin in all humility by saying that on the 12th of April, I received a fixed penalty notice relating to an event in Downing Street on the 19th of June 2020. I paid the fine immediately and I offered the British people a full apology. And I take this opportunity on the first available sitting day to repeat my wholehearted apology to the House. As soon as I received the notice, I acknowledged the hurt and the anger. And I said that people had a right to expect better of their Prime Minister. Let me also say, not by way of mitigation or excuse, but purely purely because it explains my previous words in this House, that it did not occur to me then or subsequently that a gathering in the Cabinet room just before a vital meeting on COVID strategy could amount to a breach of the rules. I repeat, that was my mistake, and I apologise for it unreservedly.
What a joke. Even now, as the latest mealy-mouthed apology stumbles out of one side of his mouth, a new set of deflections and distortions pour from the other. But the damage is already done. The public have made up their mind. They don't believe a word the Prime Minister says. They know what he is. This morning, I spoke to John Robinson, a constituent of the member for Lichfield. I want to tell you his story. When his wife died of COVID, John and his family obeyed the Prime Minister's rules. He didn't see her in hospital. He didn't hold her hand as she died. Their daughters and grandchildren drove 100 miles up the motorway, clutching a letter from the funeral director in case they were questioned by the police. They didn't have a service in the church. John's son-in-law stayed away because he would have been the forbidden seventh mourner. Doesn't the Prime Minister realise that John would have given the world to hold his dying wife's hand, even if it was just for 9 minutes? After months of insulting excuses, today's half-hearted apology will never be enough for John Robinson. If the Prime Minister had any respect for John and the millions like him who sacrificed everything to follow the rules, he'd resign.
I regret to say that we have a Prime Minister who broke the laws that he told the country they had to follow, hasn't been straightforward about it, and is now going to ask the decent men and women on these benches to defend what I think is indefensible. I'm very sorry to have to say this, but I no longer think he is worthy of the great office that he holds.
Well, I must say to my right honourable friend, I know the care and the sincerity with which he weighs his words, and I bitterly regret what has happened. I bitterly regret the event in Downing Street, as I have said. But I do believe that it is the job of this government to get on with the priorities of the British people, and that is what we're going to do.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister won't resign, will he at least give Conservative MPs on Thursday a free vote? So Conservative MPs can decide for themselves whether the Prime Minister deliberately misled Parliament or was just so incompetent that he didn't even understand his own laws.
Someone needs to have the courage to get rid of the leader. The leader who is sitting in the Kremlin and causing the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent people. And maybe I only speak for myself, I say it in all humility. I'm not going to give the satisfaction of that death's head tyrant of removing a British Prime Minister who was given an apology, who was working night and day to save thousands of lives. You went downstairs to thank his staff who were doing the same job. He has apologised. Let's show some compassion.
I thank the Prime Minister for his fulsome apology today. Given that, does the Prime Minister agree that the priority for this House and this government must be the very real challenges facing our country, particularly the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the cost of living pressures caused by COVID and worsened by Russia's war on Ukraine? And coming from Poland last week, helping with Ukrainian child refugees, may I pass on the widespread respect and admiration with which his leadership on Ukraine is held.
Conservative MP Natalie Elphicke there. And Sean, the debate over fines for parties and the Prime Minister's behaviour didn't go away, did it?
certainly didn't. That was really just Act One in this drama. So Tuesday night, after delivering that statement, Boris Johnson went to talk to his Tory backbenchers to shore up his support in Parliament. The next day, Wednesday, Prime Minister's questions, normally the highlight of the parliamentary week, always a big event. So the stakes were pretty high this week. It was very clear from the off that Boris Johnson was keen to move the debate on. But of course, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, wanted to concentrate on what they'd been talking about barely 24 hours earlier. The apology, the fines, what had happened to those lockdown rules.
Why did the Prime Minister's press secretary, Allegra Stratton, have to resign from her job?
Minister. Sorry. I bitterly regret Allegra's resignation. I think it was very sad. And I think she did an outstanding job. I do, particularly since she was the one who coined the expression coal, cars, cash and trees, which enabled the UK to deliver a fantastic COP26 summit last year.
Here's Starmer. Allegra Strachan laughed at breaking the rules. She resigned. The Prime Minister then claimed he was furious at her behaviour and accepted her resignation. Professor Neil Ferguson broke the rules. He also resigned. The Prime Minister said that was the right thing to do. The former Health Secretary broke the rules. He too resigned. The Prime Minister tried to claim he sacked him. Why does the Prime Minister think everybody else's actions have consequences except his own?
I thank the right honourable gentleman. I feel he's in some kind of Doctor Who time warp. We had this conversation yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and I've explained why I bitterly regret receiving an FPN. I apologise to the House, but he asks about the actions for which I take responsibility, and I'll tell him we're going to get on with delivering for the British people.
So, Mr. Speaker, yesterday's apology lasted for as long as the Prime Minister thought necessary to be clipped for the news. But once the cameras were off, the Prime Minister went to see his backbenchers, and he was back to blaming everyone else. He even said that the Archbishop of Canterbury had not been critical enough of Putin. In fact, the Archbishop called Putin's war an act of great evil, and the Church of England has led the way in providing refuge to those fleeing. Would the Prime Minister like to take this opportunity to apologise for slandering the Archbishop and the Church of England?
Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman. I was slightly taken aback to be Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I was slightly taken aback for the government to be criticised over the policy that we have devised to end the deaths at sea in the Channel as a result of cruel criminal gangs. I was surprised that we were attacked for that. And actually, Mr. Speaker, it turns out that policy, do you know who proposed that policy, first of all, in 2004? It was David Blunkett, Mr. Speaker, who said it was a 21st, yes it was, and she'll remember, a 21st century solution to the problems of illegal asylum seeking and immigration. He should stick with, he's a Corbynista in a smart Islington suit. That's the truth.
I think you'll find Mr. Corbyn doesn't have the whip, but I think that's a no then. Pathetic. He never takes responsibility for his words or action.
No government can be led by a Prime Minister who's in a constant state of crisis to save his own skin. And what's worse, the UK government is now led by a tag team of scandal, a Prime Minister who can't be trusted with the truth, and a Chancellor who can't be trusted with his taxes. Everyone knows that this Prime Minister is now on borrowed time until the Tory backbenchers count the cost of their council election defeat. But in the meantime, Families are counting the cost of a Tory-made cost of living crisis every day. After yesterday's farce, isn't it finally the time for him to accept that neither his party or the public can afford to keep him around as Prime Minister for 1 minute longer?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if that were true, then I don't think he'd be calling for my resignation. That's what we're going to do is get on with the job in hand, and that is deliver for the entire people of this country.
So, as we've heard, Sean, the Prime Minister apologising and acknowledging the hurt and anger caused, but has insisted that he didn't mislead the House of Commons over lockdown parties. Earlier this week, the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, said MPs would get the chance to vote on whether or not the Prime Minister did mislead Parliament, or at least refer it to the Privileges Committee. What happened?
Yeah, well, this is complicated, and it is something that a lot of people find puzzling or even annoying about the House of Commons. And that's because there's this blanket assumption that all MPs are honourable and therefore that they do not mislead the Commons. And so you hear this phrase repeated again and again, that somebody has inadvertently misled Parliament. So MPs are not allowed to accuse one another of lying in the House. It is against the rules for an MP to mislead Parliament. It's also against the rules for a minister to knowingly mislead Parliament. That's a breach of what they call the ministerial code. Now, the person who decides whether there should be an inquiry into a ministerial code incident is the Prime Minister. So, as you say, opposition politicians had approached the Speaker. They said they wanted him to allow them to take over the parliamentary timetable, if you like, so that there could be a debate on a motion saying that there should be an investigation by a cross-party group of MPs known as the Privileges Committee.
And the majority are Tory MPs.
The majority of those are Tory. It's chaired normally by an opposition MP, but the government has a majority. The government of the day always has a majority. And they would look in to these claims that Boris Johnson had misled the House, and they would decide if there perhaps had been a breach of the rules or if there'd been a contempt of Parliament, something very serious. So it wasn't going to be an instant judgment on the Prime Minister, and it wasn't MPs voting on whether or not they thought he'd misled Parliament. They were voting for an inquiry. So the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, announced at the start of the week that, yes, he was going to let MPs do this. It was going to be a motion in the name of Keir Starmer, and the debate would be on Thursday. So they basically cleared the decks on Thursday for this debate to take place. The day started with a certain amount of confusion about what the government wanted Conservative MPs to do. At the start of the day, it was thought that they wanted them to vote for a proposal not to delay the inquiry, but to delay the vote on holding an inquiry. But by the time MPs got to their feet, that plan had been ditched, and we were into a clearer run for the motion because it was going to be clear that there wasn't really going to be a big vote or argument against the proposals. And it was the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, who opened the debate.
This is about honesty, integrity and telling the truth in this place. And it's an important principle, and it's one we all share. As I say, I'm not claiming this as a Labour Party principle. It is a principle that we all share because we know the importance of it. That's why it's a matter for the House to consider. But it is a principle under attack because the Prime Minister has been accused of repeatedly, deliberately and routinely misleading this House over parties held in Downing Street during lockdown.
But the problem I have now got, having watched what I would say is contrition, beautiful, marvellous contrition, isn't my sense of it, is it rather in a sense only lasted as long as it took to get out of the headmaster's study. And that's not good enough for me, and it's not good enough for my voters. I'm sorry, it's not. I have to say, I'm sorry, that for not obeying the letter and the spirit, and I think we have heard that the Prime Minister did know what the letter was, the Prime Minister now should be long gone. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll certainly vote for this motion, but really, the Prime Minister should just know the gig's up.
I'd like to remind this House that the Leader of the Opposition twice campaigned for the member for Islington North to be put into the highest office in the land, a man who was later censured by the EHCR for anti-Semitism. And think what would have happened had he been the leader with the situation in Ukraine. Let me tell you, That is leadership that I can do without.
The Prime Minister has apologised repeatedly for what has happened. He is mortified by it. He wishes he could have done things differently and that the clock could be turned back. And he has asked for the House's forgiveness and for the ability to get on and serve the people of this country in delivering the opportunities brought about by his getting Brexit done, by leading the world in COVID vaccines and the COVID rollout, and by his clear leadership over the Ukraine issue.
So, Sean, what happened there?
So, what's going to happen next is that this committee, the Privileges Committee, is going to start an investigation. It won't be straight away. They're going to wait for the Metropolitan Police investigation to finish, and they'll also wait for the publication of the Sue Gray report, the famous report by the senior civil servant who investigated whether or not there'd been these breaches of the rules with parties and gatherings in Downing Street and Whitehall. So what it means is there will be an inquiry further down the line into whether the Prime Minister misled Parliament and broke parliamentary rules. And of course, what it does mean is that this is a story that simply will not go away.
Well, as you say, a very busy few days this week. For now, Sean, we'll come back to you in a few minutes' time. Let's go to the Scottish Parliament, to Holyrood. Join our correspondent there, Jenny Davidson. Jenny, the Scottish Government's been under some pressure for a while now about ferry contracts for the Scottish Islands. We've talked about it before on the programme, and it came up again this week. What happened?
Well, indeed, a number of times. In fact, again this week, we've had a Liberal Democrat debate. We've had the Auditor General appearing before the Public Audit Committee, and also a Labour motion on publicly run ferries. So this is certainly not going away. Now, just to give the background for those who don't remember the details, back in 2015, a contract was awarded to Ferguson Marine Shipyard to build 2 ferries to serve the Scottish Islands, which would be used by the publicly owned ferry company Caledonia and McBrain. Now back then, the cost was meant to be 97 million, and they should have been ready by 2018. Now the schedule and the costs have both spiralled. We're now up at a cost of around 250 million, and the ferries are not expected to be ready until next year. So that's a 5-year delay. Now, there's been a lot of scrutiny over this recently, in particular after the Auditor General looked into the awarding of the contract, published a report saying that he could find no documentary evidence as to why the Scottish Government went ahead with awarding this contract after being warned that there were potential problems, potential risks with it. The normal guarantees weren't in place, and they haven't been able to find out why it decided that, or indeed which government minister signed off. So this came up again this week. The Liberal Democrats noting the impact that this has had on those on the islands, this delay to the ferries, issues around transparency, and also calling for a government minister to take responsibility and resign if there are further problems.
The public and our island communities deserve answers, and they deserve accountability. Presiding Officer, this open government is asking us to believe that a £100 million contract was awarded on the eve of SNP conference without the direct involvement of a famously precise First Minister. Scotland used to be the proudest shipbuilding nation on this planet. In the 20th century, over 30,000 vessels were built in shipyards on the Clyde, whereas in the 21st century, this government can barely manage 2. Oh, how lamentably far we have fallen under SNP leadership.
Things have not progressed as we might have hoped, but progress is being made on arguably the most important element in all of that, and that is to complete these vessels as quickly as possible. It's taken a mammoth effort by all involved to get the yard moving and to build the ships that we need. Much work remains to be done, both to deliver the vessels and to make the yard efficient and competitive. The scale of that challenge is not in question, but it is a challenge that we're committed to meeting for the sake of those who depend on the ferry services.
And this has become a real issue again this week with the Arran ferry that's currently serving that route running into problems, ferry services being cancelled, and that's one of the ferries that was due to be replaced. We're going to hear more on this with the Auditor General due to appear before the Public Audit Committee again next week.
Yes, it certainly sounds like it, Jenny, and perhaps unsurprisingly so. First Minister's questions this week, the Scottish Conservatives were questioning the Scottish Government over support for motorists.
Indeed, yes. Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross going on roads and drivers. Quite a local government focus, to be fair. Obviously, we've got the council elections coming up in a couple of weeks' time. And also, perhaps, picking this issue as one that it was a bit difficult for the First Minister to perhaps to come back and pivot to anything relating to Westminster. So perhaps a safer issue for Douglas Ross. Now, he was accusing the First Minister essentially of being anti-car, anti-motorist. He talked about a triple whammy of taxes against drivers, accused the SNP of making it of making driving into Scotland's main cities unaffordable. And he was saying that, you know, there couldn't be a worse time to increase the cost of driving with fuel prices already increasing, and saying that actually it wouldn't be the wealthiest that would be worst hit by any initiatives to try and reduce car driving or charge for car driving, but it would be those who would need to drive cars to work. Now, First Minister coming back, firstly, some of these things are actually local government, they're council issues, so she was talking about, well, she supports councils in making the decisions that are relevant to their local areas, but she talked about the investment the Scottish Government has made in roads, the support it's put into making things easier for drivers, and also pressurising the UK government, she said, to reduce costs around driving. But she also said there was a balance there in terms of climate commitments as well, and they need to have that in mind.
I think everybody across the country, and certainly everybody in this chamber, knows that all of us, not just in Scotland but across the world, face some really difficult, tough, challenging decisions in the years to come about how we heat our homes and also how we travel around the country so that we can meet our climate change obligations, make that transition to net zero, but have a transport system that still supports our economy and supports the travelling public. So it's easy for the Scottish Conservatives to reduce these challenging decisions in the simplistic way that they have, but the rest of us know that these decisions have to be faced. But we, as a government, continue to support the transport system across the country. Since this government took office, we have invested in excess of £9.5 billion in managing, maintaining, improving Scotland's trunk roads and our motorway network.
People still need their cars. And right now, there couldn't be a worse time to further hike the cost of driving. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Petrol prices are rising globally. Yet Nicola Sturgeon wants to tax people off the road by hammering anyone who owns a car. And the people who will be hit hardest are not the wealthiest, but ordinary working people who need their cars and who are already struggling with the cost of living. If the First Minister carries on down this road, Nicola Sturgeon and her SNP candidates are going to force Scotland's economy into the slow lane.
And obviously this is going to be an ongoing issue in terms of tackling climate change, which everyone supports, but differing views in terms of what you do to change behaviour, or indeed if you should change behaviour around car use.
Jenny, the thorny issue of ferry contracts came up again at First Minister's questions in a question from the Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar on Scottish Government spending.
Yes, indeed, no escape from this issue at all for the Scottish Government, and it just keeps coming up. In this case, it was about a turnaround manager that had been employed at the Ferguson Marine Shipyard to sort out problems there at an overall cost of £2 million or around £3,000 a day. So that was part of a challenge by Labour's Anas Sarwar about Scottish Government spending, or what he considered money that had been wasted. He gave a figure of £3.2 billion on a number of different projects, infrastructure and health and various things, which he said that the Scottish Government had just wasted, that it was incompetent, and actually that could be better used on supporting people with the cost of living. He contrasted mums skipping meals and talked about, you know, it could be used to cut train fares, it could be used to support the Scottish Welfare Fund. Now, Nicola Sturgeon obviously hadn't seen the breakdown of the figures when she was presented with the First Minister's questions, but she said it was a mischaracterisation anyway, and she took issue with two of the figures in particular, one around a court case relating to Rangers Football Club and the other around spending on hospitals.
152 million on a failed ferry contract at Ferguson's. 146 million fixing the government's mistakes at the Edinburgh Sick Kids and the Queen Elizabeth in Glasgow. 40 million and rising on the malicious prosecution of Rangers. Almost 200 million on failed industrial interventions and loan write-offs. Nearly £1 billion for agency workers in the health service because Nicola Sturgeon cut training places when Health Secretary. Over £1 billion on delayed discharge because of their failure to fix the social care crisis. £3 billion. That is the equivalent of £1,200 bill for every household in Scotland. Every penny of this wasted money could mean more cash for the NHS, more cash for our schools, or more cash to tackle the cost of living crisis.
One of the examples, he's talking about prosecution. Prosecution decisions, of course, be matters for the independent Crown Office. And yet he is Anas Sarwar seriously saying that I, as First Minister, or any Minister of this government, should have interfered in the independent prosecution decisions of the Crown Office? Perhaps he should clarify that matter. And then the second example I will use, where he is downright wrong, is his £146 million of additional costs in relation to hospitals. So the vast majority of that figure, and I've looked at that closely because I've heard Labour use it, relates to planned costs which were in no way new, unexpected or avoidable. There's a lot of nonsense in the question that Anas Sarwar has just asked there, and perhaps he should reflect on that.
Well, the First Minister there batting that back to Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar, but harder still for them to bat back the ferries issue, which is going to run and run. We'll be hearing about that again.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Jenny. Jenny Davidson there at Holyrood. Now, normally we would go to Wales and Northern Ireland, as you know, if you're a regular viewer of this programme, to find out what's going on there. But the Northern Ireland Assembly is dissolved ahead of next month's elections, and the Welsh Parliament is in recess, but back next week. So let's catch up with Sean and find out what else has been happening here in Westminster. Over the Easter break, Sean, the government announced a pilot scheme to try to stop the flow of people seeking asylum by making the crossing over the Channel. And the plan involves sending some asylum seekers to Rwanda.
Yes, this is a big policy announcement. It means that anybody who is deemed to have entered the UK illegally from the start of this year could be sent to Rwanda. And when they get there, they'll have the opportunity to apply for asylum in Rwanda. Really, whatever happens, they are unlikely to be returning to the UK. So it was quite a big moment when the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, got up in the Commons and made a statement.
Last week, I signed a new world-leading migration and economic development partnership with Rwanda. Under this partnership, those who travel to the UK by illegal and dangerous routes, including by small boats across the Channel, may be relocated to Rwanda, where they will have their asylum claims considered. Those in need of protection will be given up to 5 years of support, including education and employment training, help with integration, accommodation, healthcare, so that they can thrive there, Mr. Speaker. This government is delivering the first comprehensive overhaul of the asylum system and this type of illegal migration in decades. At the heart of this approach, Mr. Speaker, is fairness. Access to the UK's asylum system must be based on need, not the ability to pay people smugglers. And the demands on the current system, the cost of British taxpayers and the scandalous abuses are increasing. The British public have rightly had enough.
The policies that she has announced today are unworkable, unethical and extortionate in the cost for the British taxpayer. There's no information from the Home Secretary about the costs today. Will she admit the 120 million she's announced doesn't pay for a single person to be transferred? She hasn't actually got an agreement on the price for each person. In fact, the £120 million is the eye-watering price the Home Office is paying just for a press release. So what's the rest of the cost? What is this year's budget? How many people will it cover? The Home Office has briefed it might be £30,000 per person to cover up to 3 months accommodation, but that is already 3 times more than the ordinary cost of dealing with an asylum case in the UK, and her statement says she's going to provide 5 years of cost.
I do not support the removal to Rwanda policy on the grounds of legality, practicality and efficacy. But I want to ask her about one very specific issue. I understand that those who will be removed will only be young men, that families will not be... well, the Home Secretary is shaking her head, so I've obviously misunderstood the policy in that sense. But if it is the case that families will not be broken up, and the Home Secretary is nodding, does she not believe, and where is her evidence, that this will not simply lead to an increase in the trafficking of women and children?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to meet with the Right Honourable Lady to discuss this further and actually give her further information on this. No, actually calm down and listen.
Mr. Speaker, this is a cruel and a catastrophic policy. It will not hurt smugglers, but will further seriously harm people who have fled persecution. It will do untold damage to the international system of refugee protection and to what little remains of the UK's reputation for upholding international law. Mr. Speaker, this is worse than temporary offshoring. It is offloading of responsibility altogether. As the UNHCR has said, people fleeing persecution should not be treated like commodities. And in the words of the Refugee Council, this is nothing short of cash for deportations.
She will be aware that a former permanent secretary at the Home Office, Sir David Normington, said last week about her Rwanda policy that it's inhumane, it's morally reprehensible, it's probably unlawful, and it may well be unworkable. How does she come to know better than a former Home Office permanent secretary?
The new plan for immigration, which her party and members on the opposite benches continuously vote against, have no plan to deal with these important and difficult issues, and at the same time will bring in the reform that our country needs, while making sure that we preserve the efficacy of safe and legal routes for people that are fleeing persecution to come to our country and get the support that they need.
But what I do find absolutely abhorrent and inexplicable is the way that many on the opposition benches, and in fact even in the top echelons of the Church of England and in other faiths, who have completely forgotten the images of children lying drowned on our beaches. How can they not seek to try and remedy that appalling situation? These people are not refugees and asylum seekers, they are coming from France.
Can the Home Secretary tell the House how many people does she expect to send to Rwanda in the first 12 months of this scheme? She will be aware that Rwandan government ministers are on the record as saying that they expect their capacity to be in hundreds with a few thousand over the 5-year period. Given that 28,000 people crossed the Channel last year, does she really think that this scheme is going to have the deterrent effect she claims for it?
So his question is yes, and the scheme is uncapped, and that is exactly what we've negotiated with the Rwandan government.
We can see, Madam Deputy Speaker, by the level of questions coming from the opposition, especially the Labour Party today, they are completely out of touch with the British public. But in the interest of safety, can the Home Secretary please confirm that if anybody doesn't want to go to Rwanda, they can actually claim asylum in France?
Well, Sean, as we heard there, it's a very divisive issue across the House of Commons, and mention of the clergy getting involved, which indeed the Archbishop of Canterbury did. We heard earlier in the programme. But it isn't the only issue, big issue that the government is grappling with, and that the other one is the cost of living crisis, which is how the opposition certainly see it, facing many people when it comes to paying their energy bills. Interestingly, a number of the energy bosses were in front of MPs, and they themselves seem to express quite a lot of concern.
Yes, I mean, this is a huge issue, of course, and of course it was the issue that was dominating life at Westminster before the Easter break, because we had the spring statement and those complaints that not enough was being done to help people. And since then, of course, we've had the tax rises, and of course people are seeing higher energy bills because of the changes to the energy price cap. There is another change to the cap coming along in October, and when these bosses from some of the UK's biggest energy firms appeared before MPs, they basically suggested that things were going to get worse later on in the year.
Come October, that's going to get horrific, truly horrific, and it's got to a stage now where I honestly believe the size and scale of this is beyond what I can deal with. It's beyond what I think this industry can deal with. And I think it needs a massive shift, significant shift in the government policy and approach towards this.
In the short term, government needs to do more. And I think removing environmental levies and putting them into general taxation is one thing they can do right now. Reducing VAT to zero and extending the warm home discount further. Those are tangible things which can be done before the increase again in October, and an extension of the existing £200 rebate. I think that would help very significantly all customers, because bear in mind, we're looking at up to 30 to 40% of people going into fuel poverty when the price goes up again in October. Again, I repeat, this is unprecedented, so it requires unprecedented action from government at this time.
First and foremost, one of the big issues that's been coming through is around the increase in the standing charges, because of course, customers can do everything they can to reduce their energy usage because they're concerned about the unit price of gas and electricity. But if your supplier has doubled your standing charge before you've so much as flicked a light bulb on, your bill has gone up significantly. So I'd like to know from each of you how much the standing charge for gas and electricity has gone up for your customers. If I could start with you, Mr. Lewis.
Well, the biggest increase in the standing charge is, of course, the cost of the failed suppliers, £68. That's why the standing charge has gone up so much, because of the failure of the market last year, 29 failed suppliers. All of those costs have to be recovered from the system, and that's why the standing charge has gone up. So we should be looking at how we avoid those kind of regulatory failures in the future, so the customers that were not with a failed supplier don't have to pay the customers who were with a failed supplier, which is essentially what's happened.
Mr Wood, the company's gone bust and been underwritten by the government. Why should taxpayers be paying your continuing salary at £250,000 a year? Is that morally justifiable?
I think everything we're doing right now is to try and complete a sale of the company so that we can minimise the cost to taxpayers and minimise the disruption to consumers. The work that the team and I have done over the last 6 months is we've been working incredibly hard, both on the sales process, but also on executing a very complicated price change and supporting customers through what has already been a very challenging time in the energy market.
Okay. Quite frankly, I think a lot of us found that staggering, that you just continue to be paid the same salary that you were pre-collapse.
The point here is that energy customers are now having to foot the bill for the fact that your business has gone bust, and you seem to have got on off pretty lightly.
I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, it's well documented in press. I've had my fair share of things. I think.
You're happy. You're content with that. You don't feel any sense of regret.
No, of course I feel a lot of regret. That was what happened to Avro was never anyone's intention. That was never in the thinking.
Quite a bruising session there, and of course, as you alluded to, this crisis and issue of energy bills is just going to continue. Anything to look out for next week?
Well, next week should be the last week before Parliament breaks up ahead of the Queen's speech. We know the Queen's speech is going to be on Tuesday the 10th. The plan is that next Thursday will be the last day Parliament will sit before then. Before then, they've got to finish off getting various bills through. There's going to be a bit of what they call ping-pong, with bills being sent between the Commons and the Lords as they iron out final disagreements, with the hope of meeting that deadline of Thursday.
Doesn't time fly? Well, that's all we've got time for in our roundup this week. I will be back on Monday with Politics Live at 12:15. Until then, have a great weekend.